Many people often say how great Kingdom Hearts is, claiming it is the greatest crossover series of all time. I disagree, though hard to argue when all the good crossover games had to be translated. Case in point, Super Robot Wars. At least until recently anyway, and even then you gotta order it online, which is more expensive than your standard game. As the series continued, the developers, Banpresto, who later folded into Bandai Namco Entertainment, started to include original heroes and villains of their own to help fight against alongside characters from Gundam, Mazinger, Evangelion, Gurren Lagann, and way too many other series to list. Eventually, someone must have looked at all the original characters and said, you know, we probably could make this into our own universe without any crossover fee crap. And so the original Generation series was born. But before the true start of that series on the Game Boy Advance, there was the origin of one of the core members of the cast, one of the most important characters in the series, and warranted not just this spin-off, but many more down the line. This is the review of the story of the man named Masaki Andoh and the Psybuster. Hello and welcome to The Smartest Moron, and I freaking love Super Robot Wars. When I was in college, I started to get into the series out of boredom, wanting to get my hands on a good giant robot game. Unfortunately, this was the Xbox 360 era where my only hope was the Dynasty Warriors Gundam series. I wanted something more though, and with the internet as my guide, I eventually found the games on the Game Boy Advance. I did technically know they existed, but I followed reviews heavily back then, and they weren't kind to these games. I regretted following them because after playing these games, they're a lot of fun. One thing that did throw me off was seeing a character named Masaki Andoh. His story never quite explained the game, barring his murder boner for Shu Shirakawa. I eventually discovered Masou Kishin, where everything about him would be explained. I planned on playing the Super Nintendo version, but it wasn't translated, so I moved on to the DS and actually beat it, with the worst possible ending. Whoops. Speaking of which, as I tried to go for the good ending, my save data was wiped while playing on the Retron 5. I don't even get how it happened, but my progress was ruined and I was worried I would be set back to square one. And I wasn't exactly in the mood to get back to that late point in the game due to how long it took, all for the risk of it happening again. Special thanks to Commissar Bear for letting me use his footage. Also, I had plans to briefly cover the Game Boy version of Super Robot Wars, which is an extremely different game and weird as hell, but my copy seems to have broken as I tried to take it out of the case. Because of course that would happen to me as well. And it seems to be affecting other games too, so unfortunately, I may not be able to cover SMT games like I wanted to, as well as all the other games in the Super Nintendo. And before anyone asks about emulation, my laptop isn't equipped for it and Nintendo has been cracking down hard on it. That's why I went with the Retron 5 to begin with, and should have just stuck with a regular Super Nintendo. With all that depressing stuff out of the way, let's dive into the story of Super Robot Wars Gaiden, Masou Kishin, Lord of the Elemental. And you thought we were done with long-ass video game titles. Super Robot Wars is often compared to Fire Emblem, but there's a bit more to this tactical RPG. In this game, you have pilots controlling robots often referred to as elementals, and certain ones called elemental lords. Pilots affect the stats of the robot, granting some bonuses, though you can't really change pilots on the fly. Sometimes it'll be done for you, and even then, gonna tell you right now that while this character is very cute and a decent healer, she is bad in actual combat and has the worst possible defense. That being said, later games gave her a kick-ass theme song that I can easily dance to. And that brings me to my favorite part about these games, character themes. Some have a decent generic battle theme, but others like Masaki have more unique music to them. Unfortunately, unless you get the patch, the music will not keep playing after a fight. This will be fixed by future Super Robot War games. The only time they are overwritten is when facing down a main antagonist, as a more sinister theme will take over. It's also significantly more noticeable with a certain glorious purple hair bastard I will cover in the other sections. You control a set of elementals in each chapter. not really getting the chance to send out your own team until the second half of the story, barring one certain mission. If there's a tactics game I can compare this to besides Fire Emblem, it's Final Fantasy Tactics, with how you need to use elevated maps and proper positioning to survive. There are 3 positions to attack from: the front, side, and behind. Hitting from the last 2 will do significantly more damage, but there's a catch, as you can easily be put into a bad spot. Early on, damage is kinda not such a big deal. That changes very quickly, making it more common to die in a single hit, so you have to know when it's safe enough to pull out the big guns and not just run in like a dumbass. Basically, if a machine has a named pilot, even if it looks weak, do not underestimate them, or your character is likely going to suffer the consequences. You can thankfully try to evade or defend attacks, though if you try to evade and fail, you are taking on the full damage. I rarely used it though unless very desperate. Special abilities should be considered as well. For example, using sword moves has a chance to make characters clash and block out the damage, or some characters will have the ability to attack twice, albeit randomly. This can be good for killing foes, but it can be annoying when activated. When the second attack happens, whatever ammo or energy it consumed will still decrease. Sure, you will be able to kill the enemy, but by running out of power, you can't deal with the other threats properly. And if the enemy does this, well, you better pray you can survive. There are thankfully ways to minimize damage done to you through the use of spirits, which are kinda like magic spells characters can use to turn the tide in their favor. Each pilot can learn up to 6 spirits, gradually getting more as they level up. These can offer benefits like gaining more cash after killing a foe, dodging an attack no matter what, doubling your damage output, etc. Naturally, there are limits and require a certain amount of SP to use. The enemy technically can use these, but they won't abuse them, and they rarely do it until the end of the game. Speaking of those spirits, there is one spirit specifically made to counter an ability: Lock On. It already raises your accuracy to 100%, guaranteeing a hit, but it's the only way to counter the afterimage ability. Bosses tend to have this skill, making them much harder to take down and cause me to reload saves. And yes, I am one of those save scumming assholes. The game cheats, I'll cheat back. Every time you defeat an enemy, you get some cash, and that's where the upgrade system comes in. You can upgrade their armor, health, and energy output to use special attacks. Sadly, there's no way to upgrade dodging, which would have been very helpful, but at least it kinda makes battles much more tense. And once all these upgrades are taken, the unit gains a bonus, like a massive increase in health or the ability to move more on the map. Their base stats aren't the only thing that can be upgraded. You can also choose individual weapons to power up, creating some good attacks to rely on in a pinch. More important though is the arrow next to it. If you fill that up all the way, the attack properties will change, and it will become something new, even including a new animation. For instance, this is how the Akashic Buster starts out. And now, this is the true Akashic Buster he uses within the series. Not only much more powerful and way cooler, but it even gains some range to make it much easier to hit with. You may also notice another energy it uses: Prana. This energy is rarely used but still important with some moves. Without sufficient Prana, you cannot use certain attacks, and if it keeps decreasing, your stats will also take a major hit. Take the Akashic Buster upgrade I mentioned. If I were to spam the area hitting move called Psy Flash, it would eat up a ton of Prana. Therefore, even if I have other right requirements like enough ammo and energy, if I lack the small amount of Prana, it will be useless. And yes, there are attacks that cover a wide area, though don't do a whole lot of damage to enemies unless the upgrades are sufficient. These are the map attacks, with Psy Flash and Psycho Blaster being the most useful since they don't damage your own units. Maybe Gronvale's Flame Attack is also good for the extra reach in case you just want some extra hits. Also, love the Akashic Buster and feed it immediately. Trust me, Psybuster itself is kinda meh without sufficient upgrades, as it will have a very limited range. Actually, you might want to put your cash into Psybuster more than any other machine, as the other robots do gain upgrades on their own, barring a few, and you will have to fight some later. After the tournament episode, because of course there's a tournament episode, it's safe to upgrade the others, and even then, the main 4 Heralds and Loon are likely going to be used the most due to story reasons. And again, Null's Ray. Just say no. There are way better robots. At least she gets a much better robot in the sequels. These robots are called elementals for a reason too, and it does play into strategy. Every robot, barring a few, have elemental weaknesses. Masaki, while in Psybuster, is very weak to fire type attacks because it's a wind element. A good counter to this is 2D Inner Goddess Machine since it's a water type. This is something I never really noticed in my first playthrough, but this would explain why damage can suddenly rise up. I did technically beat the game without considering this too much, but actually thinking about it in my second run helped save my ass plenty of times. Another factor to consider is willpower. This affects what kind of attacks you can use. Remember the Akashic Buster I recommended you upgrade? By doing so, you can lower the amount of willpower necessary to use it. You gain it by attacking and being attacked by 1 point each, and 5 points for every enemy killed. The exceptions are with map attacks, where you don't really gain anything at all, and everyone gains a point for a foe defeated by an ally. Again though, barring map attacks. It also serves as a buff for all characters too, so it's always worth trying to increase willpower, and making sure bosses don't keep gaining it themselves. Also, not every weapon can be used right away based on not just the range of the attack, but because of this little P symbol. If you see those, you can use the move right away with no penalties, so long as you're within range. If it's absent, you'll have to either stand still or wait until the next turn after moving to actually use it, assuming the enemy stays in range. I found a lot of the special moves usually only have one square, so again, making the Akashic Buster all that more valuable. One more thing to keep in mind is some units can recover HP over time. This does include bosses, so gathering willpower is a necessity before fighting them, unless you want all your attacks to be wasted as they heal after their turn is up. Also, the only way to heal up your robots, besides mechs that can heal like Goddess, is through the use of spirits. The Nullsray also has the ability to replenish energy, at the cost of 10 will for the pilot. You will not let me defend you at all. Normally in other games that'd be very helpful, but in this one, not so much. Mainly because since you only have 50 instead of 150, it's a gigantic loss. The level design is fairly basic, each chapter giving you a different area to fight in, with some areas repeating in later stages. Despite the fact that some of these robots can technically fly, they can't do so over trees for some bizarre reason. And sometimes your movement can be limited depending on how many enemies are around you, meaning you may not be able to get behind a foe. Other titles usually have special zones to get bonuses like to defense or restore energy and HP. This game lacks this, instead opting for elevated areas giving you better accuracy, and being on the bottom hurts that. Insert your own Star Wars joke here. Animations can also be skipped, but they are hardly long anyway, so I didn't really mind. In fact, the animations might feel like the only downside to the game, since some are kinda repeats of others. Considering how much is in this game though, I suppose something had to take a hit. What I did mind was how bullcrap the game can be at certain points. As you level up, characters can eventually be able to perform 2 actions in a single turn near the end of the game. That sounds great, right? Well, enemies can do this too in these later stages, so if they say, close in on you, they can bombard your party. And much like a shark, when they sense the weakest link bleeding, they will do everything they can to bring it down. Again, Senia, this is why you're not used. It's more frustrating when bosses have this ability, since they hit super hard and will render some spirits worthless unless you can lock onto them, possibly able to kill your character with ease. The worst of it comes in the final level, where you have to face multiple boss units right away. This is frustrating because at this point, with how few weaker enemies are around, your units will be unable to gain enough willpower to use their special moves without the use of spirits. That's why in the finale, I tend to choose characters who knew the spirit called Encourage. Their only job will be to use the spirit to increase the willpower of characters to use their best moves right away. One fortunate thing is losing a stage is non-automatic game over. You do have to redo things, but any money or experience gained during the last round is kept, meaning you could potentially lose a stage and repeat it to grind for experience. The only downside is you can't go back to the customization screen in some stages. But since levels feel like they matter in this game, I suppose I could have technically lost enough to the final boss and eventually beat it with ease. Other Super Robot War games do have more incentives to not grind, but we'll get to that with other titles. You do have some stages where you can grind for gold golems and a percentage of them being summoned each turn in those special levels. Don't be surprised if you're tempted, as the money and upgrades will help you out a ton in the future. Though again, I had to save scum in order to get the most of it, and then my save data was wiped, so you could tell how happy I was. But let's actually cover the story and see why I like it so much, and how it can sometimes annoy me. The story of Masaki Andoh starts off with some cliches that even he is willing to point out, and unfortunately this is a common thing, such as being summoned to a world to help save it using magic. Well, he's half right, considering he also has to use a giant robot, which he's quickly thrust into. Rather than the Psybuster, since it's still being fixed up, he gets the Yaum, which basically looks like a prototype version of the Psybuster anyway. I should also mention this world, Lagias, is also inside the Earth, with Masaki describing it as being inside of a hamster ball. After helping to save the day from some terrorists as they attack Langran, he is given a chance to think over joining the side of the Elementals. While doing so, he is taken in by Zeolute and his daughter Precia, who kinda act like a new family for him as his own parents died, presumably in a war given his dialogue in later scenes. His decision to join a team of Elementals boils down to two things. It's awesome, and he doesn't like to see people suffer while he does nothing. The latter is reflected much more should you reject the offer at first. He tries not to involve himself as much as possible unless angry. It's only when his friend is put in trouble does he decide to stay, realizing how much of a douche move it is to abandon her and just run away at the first sign of trouble. Regardless of what you choose, the story is about Masaki learning to accept his responsibility, eventually. After all, he is barely an adult and given a giant robot to toy around with. Quite frankly, it's a miracle it's not broken into like tiny pieces. Plus, there is something he learns as he continues to work under Feylord. They have an extent of freedom. They are technically not a part of the military for Langran, despite being summoned by them, and despite people making their robots and even doing repairs. The elementals they forge contain spirits who determine if they are worthy of using them, and usually require a good heart to operate. Because of this, Feylord and his family believe the Chosen Ones must have a good heart as well, and will do everything they can to benefit the world of Legias as a whole, not just Langran. As such, Masaki needs to learn the weight of this responsibility and not be careless, lest it lead him down a path he doesn't want to be on, which in turn kind of affects the gameplay. Yes, there are actually multiple paths Masaki can go down. Some allow him to meet new characters, while others can show up his personality in another situation. For example, for the original way I tackled the game, I originally didn't like how little I saw of Zeolute given how he adopted Masaki, but replaying the game and going down a different route, I was able to get more insight into his life, like how technically he was divorced. I assume his wife died because it's cliche and expected at this point. For the purpose of this review, I didn't go down every single route because of the limited saves and possibly screwing something up. Then I did screw up trying to get the best ending with my first run, and I already mentioned my save data being wiped, so I'm not dealing with any more stress. And wanna know what screwed me over in trying to get the true ending? Choosing where to go once Masaki finds out he can freely travel between the regular Earth and Legias. Just do yourself a favor and always go east. Going west does have a neat scene with Shu to show how powerful and ruthless he is, as well as fueling Masaki's hatred towards him, but it locks you off for getting the true ending. Not to say there isn't anything good in the other route, but for the sake of an analysis, I wanted to just get the true ending. Also, I mentioned Shu. Oh boy, Shu. Shu Shirakawa is one of my favorite characters in this entire series. He's an arrogant bastard, and rightly so given his level of power and intellect. On top of having a kick-ass machine known as the Grandson, who can manipulate gravity to damage his foes, he has one of the best theme songs ever. Seriously, look up some more footage with his voice, and you will love it. His voice actor, Takahito Koyasu, also plays Dio in JoJo's if that interests you. He also did Tony in Xenosaga if fans of that are still around watching. Shu would serve as the man Masaki wants to defeat given what happens in the story. Yet surprisingly, Shu doesn't go full evil as soon as you meet him. So we do get some scenes of him being built up and showing off his personality, and showing why even before certain events, Masaki really hates him. The story though is not just about Masaki, though he does take up a good majority of the tale. Other characters have things going on, like Tootie having to deal with the murderer of her parents who just happened to be summoned to this world, and her budding relationship with Ricardo who she ends up strangling when stressed out about Masaki. Moving on. The easiest way I can describe this series is that it's very anime. There are ways to use this term as a negative, and I mainly mean it has several things usually associated with it, like fan service, or at the very least mentioning a fan service, or certain emotional faces characters make. Although granted, the one this lady makes, I swear I've seen that in the hentai somewhere, and it makes sense considering the series loves three things above all else. 1. Giant robots. 2. Big boobs. And 3. The German language. It will make a hell of a lot more sense when I cover original generations. I think I might know one reason why this game was never translated beyond the fact that the game is huge. One of the antagonists, named Safine, has a dom and sub fetish. I'm not making that up. In order to make up for the Super Nintendo animations not being super pretty, I guess they made one character just love getting hit and she will moan every time she is struck. And yes, when the games have voice acting in the future, she will be audible. I play a clip, but I'm sure YouTube would demonetize. Oh right, silly me. This channel makes absolutely nothing. Montage time!
今のちょっと良かったわ。そうよ。その調子。すごい。
Then there's Maddock, who only briefly appeared, but considering this line he makes to a child, yeah, I wasn't gonna miss him if he died. Also, apparently he did die in the time skip, though I had to look that one up. One good thing about this premise of taking people from the surface world is the ability to have characters of multiple nationalities be a part of the story. However, as good of an idea that is, some of those same characters are also not really fleshed out. That being said, I do appreciate not everyone being defined purely by stereotypes. I just wish they had a bit more focus. Also, the game can be funny despite my complaints about Maddock, filled with a lot of jokes and characters bouncing off well with each other. I think my favorite one is when Liang Long has Sapine cornered, and she thinks he will torture her, even welcomes it, but he has a different idea in mind, giving a sermon on Chinese history, one usually driving someone insane, and I just wish I saw Masaki going through it since he describes it well enough. Sadly, it is also another case of telling instead of showing, though the reaction Sapine has is priceless. And there are other humorous bits as well, and like I said, my favorite stuff involves characters trolling each other really hard. Then there are familiars who only really serve as comedic relief, save for one. They all take the form of animals, and yes, even Shu has one, a talkative bird that doesn't shut up. Masaki in the meantime has cats, and, well, I hope you can stomach cat puns. They are not exactly perfect. Then again, I'm not exactly feline enough for them at the moment, thanks to the catastrophe that will no doubt go down in history. They just pause on the story sometimes too when it gets serious. These familiars can be a bit annoying thanks to their catitude.
God damn it, I hate you.
Remember how I said the game has multiple paths to go down? Two of them involve meeting characters, but those two feel more like comic relief and don't add a whole lot to the game. Whereas the third path offered gave me some more insight into Ricardo and trying to deal with survivor's guilt after a bad mission back on Earth. It gave the character more depth, which I felt was better than learning how unfunny this monk was. Now regarding the game being split into two parts, the first part covers Masaki's origin, getting Psybuster, and eventually dealing with one of the big bads, Shu Shirakawa. All of this stuff is set before any other Super Robot Wars game. However, then we get to a time skip that takes place after Original Generations 2, perhaps even after the third game since there are events I didn't recognize. So even if you were closely following the games that did technically make it over to the States, you might be a bit confused. Sadly, I doubt we will ever see these games translated, and if they are, my ability to review them will be unlikely due to the nature of these games, and Nintendo cracking hard on ROMs. Technically, Alpha Gaiden does have some stuff relating to Masou Kishin, but going back to that has been torture due to how slow the game runs. It's one of the reasons why I refuse to review it. Fortunately, this game offers a small summary of events, which is better than nothing at least. As for the antagonists, you'll notice I haven't really talked about them beyond Sapine and Shu, mainly because those two are the most memorable, while the rest are meh. That seems to be a problem with some of the Super Robot Wars games. The bad guys can have awesome mechs, memorable music, and awesome attacks, but the majority of them are just assholes or fail to be memorable, serving as a punching bag. The Warzone kinda makes a big mark for me thanks to his theme song and always antagonizing the group, but I couldn't tell you much else about him. Then there's Vets, a crazy guy who's in charge of the government of Begonia. Somehow. What dumbasses would elect this old crazy bastard who will just get everyone killed? Wait one moment, please. Anyway, I just never found Zetz interesting. Even as a threat, he hardly was one because his accuracy was so terrible. Now Zetz on the other hand was a bit more interesting, as we see him throughout the game working with Luzoro with a mask on and manipulating certain events to his favor, eventually moving to the top of the military thanks to his efforts. Plus I'm a sucker for blue hair characters and I love the way he goes all crazy. The problem with him is a problem I sometimes have with the story. They do more to tell me about him as opposed to showing. As a threat, they do enough of that, but on the story route, there was info to seemingly paint him as not just some random psychopath, to give him some sympathy when nothing else could be offered. This is also shown when one of Masaki's allies, Zine, is hesitant in returning to the team because she fell in love with him after he saved her life. She's not blindly going to defend Rosette's as she tried to help the gang escape from a fight with him, but she feels a lot of shame in returning because of her failure. These are interesting story bits I would have loved to see, as I do love the emotional struggle Zine seems to go through, but it barely adds anything to Rosette's. What's funny is that any kind of villain I do like in this series, they do kinda turn into heroes eventually. Hell, Axel was originally an antagonist in original Generations 2, and they ended up bringing him back in the next game since he was so popular and made him join the heroes. Now for the presentation of the story. While I do like it as the game is able to get across some scenes well with sound effects, it really does involve using your imagination a lot. See this map of Lagias? Yeah, get used to seeing that. The background never really changes, and given the nature of this world, I'm still curious as to what it looks like at nighttime. What I do appreciate is the use of character portraits, as each one is very expressive and helps the tone of the scene quite nicely. There's one scene in particular that I feel is done extremely well, which does involve some spoilers, so... This right here is the presentation at its best. You control Zeolute as he tries to take on Shu, either at first or to cover Masaki when he overworks the Psybuster. Personally, I prefer the latter due to the fallout he has with Preshia after this, as it really hammers in the guilt Masaki has about losing his father, of not being able to lift a finger. Anyway, during the fight, Zeolute can't harm Shu no matter what. Even with all the spirits and building your will to use your best moves or to even just dodge, it's a fruitless battle. And the music cutting out really hammers the scene in, making you truly realize that yes, Zeolute is dead, and he will not suddenly come back. Granted, I could have done without the game taking my money to repair the elemental. If you go down the true ending route or mess up and gang Rodney, you won't even get this one back anyway. It's just collecting dust somewhere. Speaking of which, the different paths also show you how a character is affected. For example, in the true ending route, Rodney actually ends up in a high position of power in Stadonius. In the other route though, he can either give up after the woman he loved dies, or join Masaki as a fellow herald against Rosette's. Then there's Gino, who could join Masaki in the true ending route, gaining the courage after seeing Zetz commit so many crimes. In the other route, he is unable to oppose him for whatever reason, unless Preshia is involved and he flees, otherwise he's likely gonna die. I'm kinda disappointed Rodney and Ellis don't seem to be active after Masou Kishin. Their relationship was kinda cute, but hey, if the characters got their own happy ending, even if I don't see Ellis' character portrait, that's good enough for me. For the spoiler section, since I never really got a good grasp on all the elemental pilots, I'll be mostly analyzing the main characters, Masaki, Loon, and Shu Shirakawa. Maybe throw in others when possible like Wendy. Masaki in the first half of the story is your standard shonen hero, as he can be loud and abrasive, usually a bit too cocky at times. Having lost his parents in a war, it likely affected his growth, ensuring he didn't mature before arriving in Lagias. So when given the freedom of being an elemental lord, he has to learn to accept that responsibility. One thing that gets under his skin early on is when he accidentally kills someone. Before then, he was told how pilots were able to eject and assumed the same thing would happen, until it didn't trigger killing his foe. Realizing what he did, it affects his performance in combat, nearly getting himself killed as the enemies hunt him down for revenge. This is briefly forgotten about until he ends up meeting the terrorist who wanted him dead. Masaki suddenly remembers and he tries to justify himself by saying how those people were evil for being terrorists, which calls into play his naivety. And by the time Luizoro arrives on the scene antagonizing Masaki, it eventually shows how Masaki was fighting without a real cause. Following orders or just saving his friends seems simple enough to him that he never really needed to think about it. He has the strongest elemental and the freedom to wield it. All other problems had to seem small unless things got real. The taunting Luizoro gives just shows Masaki, even after all his accomplishments so far, is still just a kid, not quite a warrior yet. As you expect, seeing the man he knew as his father die does put him into shock, which leads to Wendy. Well, I admit, I'm not quite a fan of how she snaps him out of it. I always feel there's a time and place for aggressive actions or insulting people, and all it does is make Masaki pursue Shu, a foe he can't really defeat on his own. Given what happens earlier, Masaki feels responsible for letting Shu carry on with his destruction. He knew there was something wrong with him from the moment they met, and subsequent meetings have only made him more hesitant in trusting him and more eager to tell him to jump off a cliff. Killing Zeolute, along with a whole lot of destruction he would help cause in the surface world, makes Masaki feel like his true mission in life, his true duty to save Lagias, is to find and eliminate Shu. I feel this is most reflected during their dialogue in Alpha Gaiden, which I'm just gonna play.
あなたが勝てる確率は万に一つもありません。なのになぜそう向きになってかかってくるのです。
だからサイバスだ。俺は全身全霊をかけて死をネオグランドンを倒す。俺を奏者と認めてくれるのなら俺に力を貸してくれサイバスター。
And if you got that little detail at the end, yes, Masaki does have a way to gain more power through possession, allowing the spirit of Cyphus to give him more power. Not really important here since he can never really use it throughout the game except for one stage, besides Wendy kissing him to give him back the prana he lost, which basically nearly killed him since it's kinda like life energy. But at the very least that explains why lowering it also lowers your stats. Also, relax Masaki, at least you aren't in the Fate universe where Wendy would have had to ride you, and why is this not a doujin yet? But after driving Shu back temporarily, he eventually forces himself to pursue Shu again, taking responsibility for the destruction he will no doubt cause. I'll talk more about his development when we get to original generations, but to make a long story short, Masaki has to learn to work with other pilots and realize he can't just carry this burden by himself. Shu is important, as he definitely can't be trusted, but saving the world and his friends has to come first. His new allies in this situation need all the firepower they can get, and if Earth falls, it's only a matter of time before they suddenly invade Lagias. And during the second half on both routes, as the war between Langren, Begonia, and Stadonius heats up, Masaki starts to grow into more of a leader, and it really shows how much he's grown. At this time, leadership is gone with the death of Fail, and nobody wants to take their responsibility with the Langren government. And yet it's Masaki that takes charge, trying to formulate plans to benefit his team, as he reminds Teuti that their loyalty isn't just to this one nation. It's to the world itself, and it's time they stop being used by Langren. I wouldn't be surprised if he ever took the lessons from Earth to heart, especially since the gang in original generations often get screwed over by the government, despite the fact Masaki's surface friends always save the day.
I'm the government, I'm the government, I'm the reason nothing works.
The game does sometimes call into how Masaki's destructive and reckless attitude can be damaging to himself and those around him. By choosing such options like neglecting his duties or even failing to help others, it does have some major consequences. For example, by refusing to investigate an area for Feylord, he will ruin his chance to save Wendy in the future by being unable to receive a certain item from a friend. Unless he's on the true ending route anyway. Or by destroying some soldiers in a rage, it will take longer to get his sister back and only cause more problems for her since she wasn't kidnapped. Yes, surprisingly, Gino is not really a creeper. He even taught her a new attack, well, I'm still putting him on the list just to be safe. She will not learn a certain technique if Masaki just rushes in and destroys the soldiers recklessly. And by going up to the surface to follow Shu, while he did do a lot of good and save the world multiple times, his absence likely resulted in more deaths thanks to Feylord and others going mad with power, trying to fix things but only making things worse. Remember, Luzor is still out there and some pilots are either out of commission, like Ricardo who dies, and Jine who has to be saved by the enemy. While Masaki isn't a customizable or silent protagonist, the game manages to find a way to help his personality evolve with the choices presented, giving way to another timeline depending on what is done. Nowadays, this may not seem like much. I mean, honestly, Masaki is not the most complex protagonist out there, but for a Super Robot Wars game, especially one following some anime cliches, that did impress me and made me love Masaki more. And of course, the game remembers Masaki is not some invincible god and that he does need help. While I did mention him taking responsibility, that alone doesn't make for a good leader. There are many times he could still give into his anger on the true ending route, and the first one to stop him is usually Tiyuri. She's always presented herself as Masaki's big sister, worrying about him and constantly trying to help guide him to a better path, even if she has to distance herself from him, or even just do it behind his back. For example, with the tournament episode, she took Masaki's winnings and had half deposited into a bank, while the other half was given to a charity in his name. It sounds jerky, but then you remember how wild Masaki could be. He actually didn't even seem too upset by the news either, letting his sister take care of the finances. Another example is when the Alchemy Society wanted to use the Heralds as their own personal soldiers for Langren, going into conflict with the true purpose of the Elemental Lords. Masaki is ready to storm in and tell them off, but Tiyuri has to be the one to talk to them given she can keep a calmer head. I just wish Tiyuri had a bit more to do. Her story dealing with the assassin who murdered her family was kind of interesting, as was her relationship with Ricardo, but I wanted a bit more to go on than that. Also, it seems she may suffer from the Yoko Littner romance issues, i.e. anyone she loves is destined to die given she apparently fell in love with Feylord when Masaki left Lagias, and he was going to die soon anyway due to some kind of disease or something. I just wish I could talk about him more, as he was interesting and a good person, so seeing how he fell from grace to embrace his own demise would have been interesting. What they did get right was Ricardo, the character that was kinda meant to just die admittedly, since the Zamzid would later be piloted by a young girl named Mio. They did, however, give him a character, painting him as a laid-back pilot who flirted with Tiyuri until they eventually got together. Although one negative I can give him was his awkward joke meant to show how they did eventually have sex. I feel there could have been a funnier way to introduce that, or just have a sweet morning after sex moment to help show why Tiyuri fell in love with him in the first place. If Tiyuri is meant to be the responsible big sister to Masaki, Ricardo is meant to be the carefree big brother. For instance, in the tournament episode, he was wagering bets against the wishes of Tiyuri so he could get rich, and even tried to rope Masaki into it. Tiyuri once choked him out for she was so stressed about Masaki, she assumed Ricardo was responsible for influencing his behavior. Honestly, with how often the two work together, I can kinda see that happening, as Ricardo rarely seemed to stress out, always throwing himself into danger without a second thought, albeit with more smirking than Masaki's yelling. But at the same time, the attitude was feared by Tiyuri, as he seemed a bit suicidal. I don't quite see it that way though. The chapter showing his guilt over being a lone survivor in a battle alongside his friends didn't help with that too much. It did at least show the strong bond he had with Masaki, as they have each other's back, especially when it means getting out of trouble with Tiyuri. Although it could have influenced him more than the game lets on, like when he yells at Masaki when the latter went into shock about killing someone. Chances are Ricardo would have preferred it if Masaki never piloted again if he couldn't take the pressure, and possibly cause a similar incident in the past if he just kept going. In that case, the scene of Masaki telling him off in their shared chapter kinda makes more sense to me, and really demonstrates Masaki's growth from all the way back then. Even his death scene was handled well too, sacrificing his life for the woman he loved as he tried to recover from the last fight. It's another example of how the sound effects are able to carry a scene effectively. It's just a shame Mio hasn't proven she was a good replacement. She's essentially comic relief. Not really bad, but nothing else is done with her in this game at least. Yanglong also doesn't add much to him either beyond being the most serious and competent member of the team, taking his training super seriously. I call him the Tien of this group, but well, let's face it, Yanglong is at least relevant and one of the best pilots in this series. Unlike Tien in Dragon Ball Super, which I don't even feel like I need to talk about.
Kiko, yourself.
Masaki's love interest, though. Well, I think Wendy is fine, despite the fact that she's way older than him, like about at least a good decade. She has some good scenes with Masaki, being the one who ultimately helps him through the burdens of being a pilot. Like that one time when he was confronted regarding his naivete, regarding the terrorists being purely evil, or when Zeolute died and he needed to defeat Shu. I don't think I saw too much of her personality on the true ending route though, when on other story paths she has to confront her evil twin who lives on inside of her. You know, even after all the anime I've consumed over the years and reviewing stuff like Shadow Hearts, some stuff still surprises me. We do at least get a few more scenes, like with her being an angry drunk, or lamenting how she had to kill her sister when she suddenly gains a body of her own. I did mention this game was weird, right? But yeah, I never felt like I could dive too deep into some characters, and Wendy was sadly among the top of the list. She has a personality, certainly better than Kyrie and DMC4, but it's one I just came to expect at this point. Though what I found the most interesting was her relationship with the second of Masaki's harem, Lune Zoldark. Lune was a character Masaki meets on the surface, one who initially came at him for revenge, but relented when she comes to terms with the truth about her father and Masaki. She would end up falling for him pretty damn hard, and Masaki, being your standard shonen dumbass, never really returned the affections. Hell, in original generations, he just made things worse with fake compliments. Maybe he kinda has a thing for her, but it's never really stated in any game I know of, and especially not in this one. There's even a moment where they're at the beach and he really just ignores Lune while she's wearing a bikini, mostly focusing on Wendy's figure since, well, I guess that's where all the hormones exist. Nevertheless, she keeps proclaiming herself as Masaki's girlfriend, even as she learns of Wendy. Rather than engage in the tired tradition of women arguing because they like the same person, Lune actually treats Wendy with respect and cares for her well-being a great deal, even trying to convey Wendy's feelings to Masaki so he stops being a stubborn idiot. On top of that, Lune is just straight up awesome, able to prove why she can keep up with Masaki not just in gameplay. She is a trained super soldier, able to handle herself when outside of a robot with ease. Sometimes the one to lead missions when Masaki is unable to, due to his lack of direction. And there are good moments when she is able to just talk to people, convey her feelings to the likes of Rosalie. Rosalie doesn't have that much going on in the plot, but one interesting thing was how she tried getting close to someone, train under them, for the purpose of revenge, to kill the man who murdered her father with his own skills. But somewhere down the line, because the guy was a decent person, she did end up caring for that same man, and was legitimately sad about his death. Lune is able to relate because she felt the same as Rosalie, all until she was able to recognize what her father and Masaki were fighting for, seeing the ideals they stood for as well as seeing the good and bad they each possessed, and ultimately deciding Masaki was in the right. It made me wish more was done with Rosalie after the talk. Maybe there would have been had I not convinced Fang to stop being a traitorous dickhead, but I'm also the kind of guy who wants to save everyone, so I'm not getting that dialogue choice. Thankfully, she does seem to get more stuff to do in the sequels. Back to Lune's relationship with Wendy, there's a moment in the other ending where she has to try and save Wendy alongside Masaki. In other anime, this would usually only require the love interest to intervene. However, Lune is just as important as Masaki, needing to also help Wendy snap out of control of her evil sister. It's kind of funny how as a love interest, Lune doesn't add a whole lot beyond some comedy, but anywhere else in any other role, she is simply amazing and easily in my top 3 favorite characters list in all of Masou Kishin. Hell, if you told me she and Wendy ended up together without Masaki, I would certainly be all for it. At the very least, I'm curious how this relationship will develop, especially when Senya reveals that thanks to Masaki's status, he is technically allowed to have 2 wives in Legius, something both girls have no issues with. Now for the final character. Let's close out with Shu Shirakawa. The dude is a magnificent bastard, always present with a smirk and usually for a good reason. This is the kind of guy even some villains fear simply because he is so powerful and knows how to use people. Add to that the sheer raw power of the grandson, and later the neo-grandson, and you have a guy I'm still surprised isn't completely evil. Yeah, turns out he was bound to the demon god Volcrus, the main threat Masaki and the gang were meant to take down. It's a bit uncertain how much he was controlled considering how Shu acts, but the true ending does show Volcrus could take control of Shu completely depending on the situation. Unfortunately, his memory is kinda hazy, so we never find out why he decided to make a deal with the devil. However, with how he values his own freedom and is so willing to take down anyone who would dare try to take it away from him, I began to see the similarities between him and Masaki. Oh, trust me, they are opposites for the most part. The grandson is slower than the sidebuster and prefers warping or trapping foes compared to using sheer speed to get in close. And from their personalities, well, I think that's obvious. Yet they are both competent individuals who believe in their own skill. And both are chased by a pair of women, and both aren't exactly, well, handling that situation well. At the very least, I don't see Shu offering Monica or Sabine a wedding ring, or giving into the whole polygamy thing. Speaking of which, yes, Sabine was able to break the mind control by her lust for Shu. Just let that sink in for a second. But the main similarity I see is both taking responsibility for their actions and the benefit for the world. Shu actually planned on dying by Masaki's hand all this time, making the Earth strong enough to fend off alien forces who would devastate it, something that is proven in an alternate timeline we will eventually cover. He did so to try and be free of Volcrus' control as well, and was eventually resurrected because the marketing team panicked and didn't want to face the fangirls. I mean, he was necessary to resurrect Volcrus. Yes, that was it. Even without his full memory, Shu was taking steps to taking care of Volcrus once and for all. In the other route, he actually does get Masaki to help him out by leading some Volcrus clones to his team who are able to fend them off. Yeah, this is why Shu is more of an anti-hero. Even in the true ending, Masaki admits he can't fully trust him, and crap like this is why. Yet Shu also apologizes for this. While his methods are questionable, it shows not only is he making sure threats like Volcrus no longer hound him and repeats his mistakes, but he does trust Masaki in the power he has, along with his friends. And more importantly, both characters value their own freedom and don't want to be manipulated. And we already saw that with Masaki pretty much just standing up against Langran. While they aren't friends, at least they can still help each other out from the biggest threats in both worlds. When it comes to the endings, I honestly like the one with Rosette's and Wendy's sister a tad bit more. The conflict seemed to flow much more naturally compared to Shu, who just shows up, tells Masaki about the evil priest who is invincible, and they join together to beat him. The alternate route has a bit more finality to it, with threats taken care of and the heroes looking forward to the future, making you curious what might happen next. The true ending has the girls speculating if Masaki and Shu are into each other. I'm assuming it's because Masaki endlessly chased the guy and was the one person who could snap him out of mind control. Plus, given the amount of porn that exists of rivals who hate each other, yeah, that totally makes sense to me now. Granted, you'd think Wendy would be a bit more serious about this since Shu killed Zeolute, but whatever. And I think that's all I can say about Masou Kishin, as far as anything meaningful is concerned. While it's by no means a deep game, I still have a ton of fun and there is a bit more to the characters than just a bunch of anime tropes. Most of the time anyway. Like I said in the Xenosaga reviews, a game doesn't have to be complicated for me to consider it good. Having those themes is a plus and makes it more memorable, but the stories in Super Robot Wars are just fun. Yeah, I wish more was done, probably more was done in the DS remake, but what we have thanks to the translation is kinda good enough for me. Now please translate the other games for the love of all that's holy. Next time though, we continue our look at the series on the Game Boy Advance. Super Robot Tyson, Original Generations. Yeah, they changed it from War to Tyson for some bizarre reason. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope to see you next time on The Smartest Moron.